The house, it sort of captures the imagination of anyone standing at the bottom of that hill and looking up. It's a pretty sight.
You Monaghan sportsman, I pray you draw near. The deeds of a hero you quickly shall hear. The deeds of a hero who lived near Belly Bay. They called him Hugh Jackson, I hear people say.
The Jacksons lived in the northern part of what is today the Republic of Ireland, right on the borderlands. And they were linen producers. They had mills. And they were also big horse people. Of course, lots and lots of folks in Ireland are. In 1798, there was an uprising in Ireland, a movement called the United Irishmen. United because both Protestants and Roman Catholic Irishmen rebelled against the English government. It, like other rebellions, failed. A whole generation of the Jackson family, as a result, immigrated to this country. And not only the Jacksons, numbers of other people, and many of them made their way into this same section of the country. The Jacksons came first to Philadelphia and then to Nashville. James Jackson, who was the one who came here to Florence, lived in Nashville a number of years, and he married there and began his family there, was in business in Nashville, had a store and was a banker and a financier. But after the Chickasaw treaties of 1816 and 1818, the lands north of the Tennessee River came into the hands of the United States government and were open for settlement. James Jackson was one of a group who invested in what became Florence, a group of men who called themselves the Cypress Land Company, and they included not only James Jackson, but Andrew Jackson, who of course was in Nashville, and John Coffey in Nashville, both of whom had come through here at the time of the Creek Wars, the Creek Indian Wars, and the War of 1812, and had seen this land and understood the potential. This group of people bought the land from the government and hired an Italian engineer, Ferdinand Sonona, to lay out the plan of Florence, and the lots were sold at auction and the town of Florence was begun. When James, and by then his wife Sarah Moore McCullough, she was a widow when she and James married, when they moved here in December of 1818 and began to the establishment of their home in Florence, it was probably a project that took several years, but the plantation that would be their home was called the Forks of Cypress, and the land that James had bought for this was situated at the juncture of Big Cypress and Little Cypress Creeks, hence the name, the Forks of Cypress. The house that was built overlooking the joining of the creeks was a house of very interesting architecture. It was one of the earliest of what we now call the Greek Revival style. The most prominent feature of the house to us today is this the colonnade, which surrounds the whole house, a peristyle, meaning going all the way around, colonnade of Ionic columns. Scholars think that this was, well, it certainly was one of the earliest houses or structures in America built with the surrounding colonnade. It could have been the first. There were certainly some early surrounding colonnades in Mississippi, but none of them were of this formal Ionic order, as the Forks was. It was most probably the design of an architect, William Nichols, who was an Englishman who immigrated to this country and designed a number of buildings, including the first capital of Alabama, and I think of North Carolina and Mississippi as well, but several prominent buildings, none of which are still standing today. The date of the house is uncertain, but it probably was begun just as soon as they came, and maybe possibly even before James moved his family down in December of 1818. The house, we see the ruins of it today, but the house sat on top of a hill, and the prospect there was, one of a certain resting site. The house was a frame house of primarily of poplar, and the porch that surrounded it, part of on the exterior, was on top of a limestone foundation. In order to make these round columns, they made bricks that were pie-shaped and of graduated sizes that gave the graceful curvature of the columns themselves. And on top of the brick column, there was a plaster lime base that was mixed with gravel and charcoal and molasses and horsehair. People used to talk about what was in the plaster of those columns. I don't know, I remember as a child thinking horsehair and molasses, and that sounded, of course, very exotic, and I wondered later if that was just a story, but we know today, because we can examine this, and scientists have examined it, that it's true, that that was part of the content. The Jacksons also brought their love of horses with them. By the 1820s, after James Jackson had moved into North Alabama and had enough land and resource to have his own stables, he turned back to one of the great passions of the Jacksons, which was the breeding of good horses. One of the Jacksons had a famous horse in Ireland called Crazy Jane, who won a number of these races there, and was such an important horse that they actually had a funeral for her when finally she died, and it was a large public event to which many people came. In 1835, James Jackson bought Glencoe, who would turn out to be the greatest horse, the most successful horse to be imported from England of anybody. The eventual importance of Glencoe is measured by the realization that by the late 20th century, virtually every thoroughbred in the world was a descendant of Glencoe. The exciting horse that was bred here in Florence was not an import, was a daughter of Glencoe, out of a daughter of Leviathan, a mare called Giantess. She was bred as part of a bet. A high-stakes race was offered for horses bred in 1838, and they would race 3 years later. And the prize was to be $35,000, which is pretty incredible. Initially there were to be a number of horses in it, but it wound up with just 2 horses, one of which was this filly from the Forks, the Glencoe filly, which was because of her unpronounceable names, what she was usually called. Of course, she won, and after she won that race, she took the name, was given the name Petona. Petona reached her height of fame in another race that was a periodic competition between the North and the South, and it was an ongoing rivalry. And this was a golden age of racing. The race of 1843 was held on Long Island, was to feature the champion of the North against the champion horse of the South, and Petona was representing the South. Everybody followed the races then. I mean, everybody. It was just the thing, and there were publications dedicated to that, and the crowd, swelled and swelled. The Long Island Railroad had sold so many tickets to get out there that they didn't have seats on the train, and those who were left behind were so frustrated they trashed the stations in New York. The stock market closed down for the day. They took carrier pigeons over there to report the results as fast as anybody could. It was a hyped thing. Of course, Petona won, and there's a well-known print, Nathaniel Courier print, that shows Petona edging out fashion in that race on Long Island.
Well, the Forks left the Jackson family in the early 1900s and was probably, we think, moved through two families. And then it came the property of the Haddocks, who the senior Haddock sold it to my great-grandfather in 1933. The story in my family has always been that he was impressed that he lived approximately a mile and a half north of there. And he was always impressed that it seemed to rain down there. It didn't rain on his property. And the family story always went that he told them that one day he would own that place. And he did. My great-grandfather passed away, and in his will, he had 3 children. They drew straws. Since my great-grandfather left no specific will as to who got what, they divided his estate into thirds. And the Forks went to my great-uncle, who was Rufus Dowdy. He was an engineer on Dowdy and Associates out of Birmingham, and was an avid antique collector. And so it became his property and kind of a museum under him, not just a residence. He not only lived there when he was in town, but he used it as a collection point for what he purchased. I was born in '48, and my grandparents lived on the bottom level of the Forks, and my parents and I lived on the upper level. So I lived there until I was 3, and my oldest sister was born there. And it was quite a place. It was a castle, a fortress to a 3-year-old. It was quite interesting. And family weddings were held there, family celebrations, birthdays, anniversaries. My aunt was actually married, not there, but married, and her reception was held there. And there were other events planned before it was burned, but it was June the 6th of 1966, and I had, I can't remember the exact day, but I had just graduated from high school. And I had been down there all morning checking on the house, because we checked it daily, and because it had been broken into a couple of times. Everything was fine. I came home, took a shower, and a thunderstorm came up, much like it would any other time. And with a big clap of thunder, and the house shook, and which is not uncommon out there. And a gentleman pulled up in the driveway and said the house was on fire. So we ran down. I literally ran down, and my dad and I were the first ones there. And the entire house was on fire at one time. It had hit the central wiring, and every room was on fire at once, from the floors, from the baseboards and everything. So it didn't necessarily burned down. It burned completely up all at one time. In about, and I'm sure you may have seen those pictures of the superstructure on fire. That picture probably took place in less than 20 minutes. Since it was a wooden structure, it simply just went up like a tinderbox with all of its contents. And one of the columns is missing. There were two massive chimneys on each end. And so during the night of the fire, the chimneys all collapsed. And one of the chimneys collapsed out and took out one of the columns. The base is still there, but the column's missing. So there are 23 columns still remaining. Many people tell us, even to this day, that they remember going through the house, or they remember when so-and-so had a reception there, or they remember as a school group, because there used to be school groups come there. There used to be bus tours come there. And so, it became quite a well-known place. And people had a great deal of love for it. And to this very day, when I speak about it, or when the subject comes up, there are a lot of people who tell me where they were and what they were doing when the house burned and how they got the news. And I had the greatest childhood of growing up and roaming the creeks and fishing, and my friends, and it was a great spot. And all my friends who grew up with me keep telling me how lucky I was. And I was.